We're live.
Okay. All right. Super. Welcome everybody. We are back from a break and jumping into a different topic, but one that I think is really important and getting some background on it this morning from a couple different agencies. Welcome back to Peter Laflamme and Bethany Sargent, and I'm going to turn it over to you to take it away on this issue around CAFOs and runoff.
Thank you very much, Chair Watson, and thanks for having us back in today. Again, for the record, I'm Pete Laflamme. I'm Director of the Watershed Management Division at Vermont DEC, and I'm joined today by our Deputy Director, Bethany Sargent, and by our attorney, Eric Guzman. And the three of us will sort of take turns in terms of both the presentation, but certainly answering questions, because this issue, of course, relates to both permitting out of the agency, some legal issues, some statutory changes that we'll walk through. But I just wanted to start just sort of as a foundation. First, just quickly explaining the Watershed Management Division. Our division deals with all issues around maintaining and improving the quality of surface waters in Vermont. So we have 8 major programs in our division that you're all familiar with or have heard of. Certainly our lakes program, our rivers program, and our wetlands program deal with a wide variety of regulatory issues in each of those programs around caring for those 3 resource types and issuing permits, doing monitoring, and calling out additional work that needs to be done. And we have 3 programs that deal with potential impacts. We regulate through permitting, both state-based and federally based, which we'll be talking about this morning, in our stormwater program that deals with a number of issues around new development and retrofitting existing development for the purposes of controlling and treating stormwater runoff. We have our wastewater program that deals with discharges of both municipal and industrial wastewater and also pretreatment facilities. And then finally, our CAFO program, which currently is mostly involved with inspections concurrently with the Agency of Ag, and then doing compliance and enforcement follow-up when necessary. And so just providing that context of sort of that integrated and holistic management of surface waters that goes on in the division, and balancing the work through permitting and compliance and enforcement when necessary across those different programs that could potentially impact surface waters. So I mentioned that our work is a combination of state-based permitting and federally based permitting. The 1972 Clean Water Act, passed by Congress, that you're all familiar with, did several important things. It created the necessity of states to develop water quality standards to protect uses in waters, beneficial uses, swimming and fishing often get called out, aesthetics, uses, water supplies, etc. So all of our waters are classified for their uses, their designated uses, and then we have our water quality standards, which set forth criteria that need to be met in order to support those uses. The other thing the Clean Water Act did was to require that all discharges of pollutants to waters require a permit, a federal permit. The so-called NPDES program, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. When you hear NPDES, those are federal permits. In 1974, EPA delegated to the state of Vermont, and currently 47 states have this delegation of the state acting in place of EPA issuing federal permits, and we also issue state permits. Our division issues 43 different permits for all sorts of different activities, but we are a mix of federal and state permits. So through the delegation from EPA to the state, we do issue those federal NPDES permits, but we do so under the oversight of EPA. Region 1 EPA out of Boston specifically is our regional office of EPA. So they look to make sure we're issuing NPDES permits correctly and sufficiently as part of that delegation. And again, we were delegated in 1974 the suite of NPDES permits that we issue several different types of NPDES permits in stormwater, our MS4, our municipal permit, our industrial permit, and a federal construction permit when land greater than 1 acre is opened up as part of a construction activity. We issue an NPDES permit that's called for in the Clean Water Act to those construction activities. We also issue wastewater, direct discharge wastewater, and industrial and pretreatment permits. Those are all NPDES permits. And the permit we're here today to talk about, the CAFO permit, is also an NPDES permit. And as we'll talk about, and as shown on this slide, we'll talk about the de-delegation petition that was filed by CLF. And I'll just mention it now for one reason, and we'll get into it a little bit more in subsequent slides. But the NPDES program is delegated to the state in whole. It's not a piecemeal delegation. So the de-delegation, the petition filed by Conservation Law Foundation, the NRC, and Lake Champlain Committee is to de-delegate the entirety of the NPDES program back to Boston. In other words, the petition calls out to EPA Region 1 that the state, in the allegations of the petition, is not currently implementing the NPDES CAFO program correctly here in Vermont. If this gets to the point that EPA delegates the state, all of the NPDES programs go back to Boston. It's not only the CAFO program. So wastewater permitting, stormwater permitting, we in total have 8 different NPDES permits that we issue. All of that delegation would go back to Region 1 in Boston, and they would issue those permits for the state of Vermont. Interestingly, I mentioned there are 47 states that are currently delegated to issue NPDES permits. 2 of those non-delegated states, 2 of the remaining states are in Region 1, our neighbors to the east and our neighbors to the south. So New Hampshire and Massachusetts are not delegated currently, and NPDES permits are issued out of Boston. But I'm going to turn it to Bethany now, who's going to talk about the de-delegation petition and the EPA findings.
So Steve mentioned Conservation Law Foundation, Vermont Natural Resources Council, and the Lake Champlain Committee submitted the de-delegation petition to EPA in March of 2022. In that petition, they requested that EPA either direct Vermont to take corrective action around its CAFO program, or to remove all of our NPDES delegation, as Pete described. So the petition alleged, and confirmed that ANR is the only authorized delegated Clean Water Act entity, and because of the current regulatory approach that's shared between the Agency of Natural Resources and the Agency of Agriculture, that the water quality regulations do not comport with that. That joint regulation is confusing and is harming farmers, and that as an agency, we are not monitoring and enforcing nutrient management plans, issuing CAFO permits that are enforcing violations. So that was the basis of the petition that was submitted. From that point, EPA conducted its own independent investigation of the claims made in the petition and reviewed the basis of the petition. And then in September of 2024, communicated in a letter to the agency what their findings were based on that investigation. So they, reiterated that concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, are point sources that are subject to federal NPDES permitting. That no individual CAFO permit has been issued in the state of Vermont, despite the fact that there are 37 large CAFOs, 104 medium CAFOs, and more than 1,000 small farms that could potentially be CAFOs, and that CAFOs are not authorized to discharge without a permit. And importantly, that a NPDES permit is required at the time of discharge. Otherwise, that discharge is not authorized. So in that letter, sort of in summary, they highlighted that the agency has not been appropriately, managing CAFOs under its Clean Water Act delegation, that the agency doesn't have the staff capacity to do that, consistent with federal regulations. And that dual authority, that split between the Agency of Natural Resources and the Agency of Agriculture, has not led to compliance with the Clean Water Act. So specific to that investigation, they reviewed 113 complaints that were received by the Agency of Natural Resources and or the Agency of Agriculture between that time frame 21 to 23. Of those 113 complaints, 26 were unresolved. 51 of those complaints, despite information on that record, of, including photos and documentation of discharges, were concluded as no violation found, and as I mentioned earlier, no NIPD's CAFO permits were issued. 8 of those complaints were noted as violations of the Clean Water Act, but when those discharges were observed, the facility was allowed to correct the violation without additional enforcement actions or penalties. And then they also conducted 10 inspections in that time frame, and observed that several of those farms had ongoing or recent discharges that were not addressed. So as a result of those findings, they required the Agency of Natural Resources to develop a corrective action plan to address the deficiencies that they found. They called out 7 elements to be included in that the ANR staff needed to inspect all potentially jurisdictional farms to determine if a CAFO permit is required. That is part of that. ANR was responsible for reviewing nutrient management plans and issuing CAFO permits. That we needed to comprehensively track permitting, monitoring, enforcement action. That we needed to enforce against farms that were discharging without a permit. That we needed sufficient staff to implement those requirements, that we needed to seek statutory clarity around statutory and regulatory authority to fully implement those requirements. And finally, we needed to provide a date by which that action plan would be fully implemented. So we were given 90 days to develop the corrective action plan and submit it to EPA. It was organized around the following elements. So clarifying roles and responsibilities, that it was ANR's independent ability to define those roles and responsibilities, and the authority of the 2 agencies, obviously subject to public comment and EPA approval. That Agency of Natural Resources had the sole authority to determine if a CAFO or if a farm needs a CAFO permit, and to require those permits when, for both point source discharges and if a non-point source discharge if the farm hasn't followed their nutrient management plan. And that the Agency of Ag would continue to regulate farms that did not require a CAFO permit. It also highlighted some of the data management needs, database development in order to better track and monitor the CAFO permitting and enforcement activities. It added clarity around Agency of Natural Resources' role in reviewing nutrient management plans in the process of issuing CAFO permits, and that those nutrient management plans needed to be available for public review. That ANR should develop a CAFO rule and update our medium farm general permit and the associated forms. And that we would commit to an annual reporting and tracking of indicators to demonstrate our progress toward implementation of the corrective action plan. And then finally, as called out in the EPA letter, it described our plans for furthering our capacity in the CAFO program. So at this time, we have 2 FTEs within the CAFO program. We, through the corrective action plan, proposed to move an existing position into the CAFO program And then the governor's budget also proposes an additional 2 FTEs for the CAPO program, as well as $850,000 to help support some of that database development work, to potentially contract some additional assistance in conducting those inspections as we evaluate the extent and number of farms that would need CAPO permits. Part of that plan is also to provide a report to EPA in December of 2026 that evaluates if any additional capacity needs within the program to fully implement our responsibilities under the NIMBY's CAPO.
So as Bethany mentioned, our corrective action plan went down to EPA on December 6th, and on January 17th, we received EPA's response to our corrective action plan. And in the response that I'll run through now, EPA called out 11 areas that they felt like needed additional clarity or additional work. And I should mention, I didn't mention when I started, this presentation and the underlying documents from which these quotations are drawn are we sent them to Jude yesterday, and you should have them all available. So we sent the original David Catch letter, we sent the our corrective action plan, we sent the January 17th response, as well as a timeline of all of these events that simplify. It's more information than is here in the PowerPoint, but less information than the voluminous letters. And we also have a fact sheet in there. So all of that information is available for you to look at. But this PowerPoint, given the amount of time we have this morning, this PowerPoint is designed to sort of hit the high points. So on January 17th, EPA responded to our corrective action plan with the following. This is a summary of their feedback, that Vermont must more clearly identify that ANR is the authority for regulating CAPOs, that we cannot rely on our colleagues at the Agency of Agriculture to make determinations regarding discharges or potential CAPO jurisdiction, that we need to take steps to identify all farms that are discharging in the state regardless of size, and that therefore may need a CAPO permit. And set forth a few different ways of looking at that. EPA remains concerned that our proposed staffing levels are not sufficient to the task. We need to explain in greater detail how we will inspect all potentially jurisdictional farms, determine which of those farms need CAPO permits. We need to review the nutrient management plans from those farms and issue CAPO permits consistent with federal Clean Water Act requirements. We need to clarify that ANR will regulate all farms subject to the Clean Water Act, defined as animal feeding operations. That we need to clarify that our Agency of Agriculture does not have authority to regulate farms under the Clean Water Act, that authority needs to reside in the delegated entity here in Vermont, the Agency of Natural Resources. That we need to explain in detail how ANR will comprehensively track, monitor, and implement enforcement. That we need to explain how ANR will regulate all farms, including small farms. We need to clarify that nutrient management plans must be at least as stringent as federal CAPO regulations. We need to adopt a CAPO rule that complies with the Clean Water Act, and frankly, which will bring the federal CAPO regulations up to the current standards here in Vermont. And that we need to set forth our timeline and our plan, identifying key interim milestones and deadlines for tracking progress. EPA wants to be able to measure our progress incrementally towards the goals, the 10 goals that they've set out. So right now, and they've given us until March 17th to send version 2 of the corrective action plan, remedying the 11 deficiencies that were found. And that's what we're currently working on. We are developing version 2 of the corrective action plan, which we will send down to EPA by their deadline in March. we're working on developing necessary statutory changes. We've been working with the legislature in terms of setting forth what those statutory changes would be. Necessary for us to be able to assume the responsibilities that EPA is telling us we must do to maintain our delegation. We've been working with our colleagues at the Agency of Agriculture in terms of sizing up what we need to do to be able to share their extensive database on farming activities here in Vermont and communications with those farms. We've been preparing to stand up doing CAFO inspections currently. In the past, we've participated with the Agency of Ag on certain inspections. Now we need to be in the primacy role in terms of conducting CAFO inspections, looking for discharges and determining which farms do need CAFO coverage. We are planning on, as part of this, we need to adopt a rule setting forth the standards and the process of CAFO permitting. And we will be standing up a stakeholder process probably within the month, beginning that process of a more extended pre-rulemaking, working with the Agency of Agriculture and with a number of farming groups and other interested parties throughout the state to talk through our ideas on the CAFO rule and to, like I say, engage in an extensive pre-rulemaking process to develop that rule prior to putting it into formal rulemaking, and then finally doing just that, kicking off formal rulemaking. So we have a long laundry list of things we need to do, and we're working hard at doing that right now. And we're also looking forward to working with the legislature in terms of promoting the statutory change and other changes necessary, seeking the positions that Bethany mentioned, and the funding necessary to do the tech work in terms of merging our databases with the Agency of Ag and then other program support activities necessary to do this work. And again, all of the underlying documents that call out these mandates in greater detail are provided to you all. And that is the overview testimony we wanted to be the sort of the foundational testimony. Obviously, there are one or two details in all of this, but we wanted to provide sort of that overview and background context for the dedelegation work that you've been hearing about and where we are currently in that work. So that concludes our testimony.
Question.
Great. If you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh.
So that's okay. It just takes up my the bulk of my monitor. Thank you. I guess we'll start with any questions. That I guess I'll also just say that that's a lot, and thank you. And I'm looking forward to talking more about the statutory requirements and what you need from us. So I think I saw Senator Williams. You had your hand up.
Just kind of some background information. How many farms do we have in Vermont? And how many are in violation?
One of the slides that we showed, the farms are called out by size. So we have a certain number of large farms, medium farms, and then upwards of 1,000 of the small farms. So a considerable number.
Sure. So is there any possibility they're going to be able to repair this in time?
I'm sorry.
I think you're going to be the enforcer. What are these farms going to need to comply?
Well,
I'm a farmer, so I'm concerned.
It depends on each farm, and a lot of the farms that we're talking about are currently regulated under state law by the Agency of Agriculture. So in a lot of cases, the work necessary is currently being done. It's investigating farms that currently have discharges or have had recent discharges, and working through the CAFO permitting program. The CAFO permits are a 5-year permit, and they include a schedule of compliance typically. The expectation is if something that needs to be corrected with a NIPD's permit needs to happen, it can't happen the next morning. So I mean, there's typically a 5-year period of compliance, and there's also financial assistance provided by both agencies, the bulk of which is the Agency of Agriculture, and then also NRCS provides funding for doing the work necessary. So there's time and there's funding. I mean, the argument, as with all funding sources, is is it enough funding? But
So is there a possibility some of these farms don't even know that we're going to be shifting gears on?
And that's a lot of the work that we're hoping to do through the stakeholder outreach, working with different farmers coalitions, farmers associations, and then individual farmers themselves, getting the word out, working with our partners at the Agency of Ag and ourselves in terms of reaching out to farms to notify them of this, and work cooperatively with them as we design the rules and the permit standards.
So has the EPA actually come on, put out boots on the ground to
Yes.
confirm this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the EPA staff and then their contractors participated in a series of inspections here in Vermont, and they intend to continue to do that.
Through NRCS work with them for
And this was EPA in the first place as the permitting authority.
Great. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, Senator Bongartz.
So what happens in the meantime? You need the statutory change, you're going through rulemaking. How much work can you be doing toward meeting the requirements that have been articulated until you get the statute and statutory changes, the 850,000 word review and the rulemaking?
We're currently working with a couple of farms now in terms of the process for applying for CAFO permits on a very limited basis. Again, right now we have 2 staff that are being pulled in different directions right now between working on the corrective action plans, the rulemaking inspections, continuing on a couple of different farms that are in the compliance and enforcement pipeline right now. So, but we do anticipate being able to issue at least a few CAFO permits over the next year as we continue to do this other work side by side.
So you referenced the 2 people. How is that? Do you have the staff you're going to need to do this over the next course of the next?
No, we right now we have the 2 folks. We are going to be moving a currently empty position into that program to bring it up to 3. We're asking through the governor's budget for an additional 2, and then we've committed to taking stock, so we'll have 5 at that point. And then we're committed to taking stock at the end of 2026, at which time we'll have the rule, we'll have a lot more information from inspections, and at that time, stopping and considering, do we need more people, and if so, how many?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is just for the committee's knowledge, there's a bill that will be introduced probably today in the Senate. That is my bill that I worked with the agency and the secretary on, that I think is intended to meet the requirements of the EPA order and also establish the stakeholder process. So hopefully we'll be able to take it up when we come back to get this moving so that we meet the deadline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. We'll hopefully be able to turbocharge it, get it done. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay. All right. Well, I see that we have in the room, I think I saw Mr. Collier. I am not sure if I saw Ms. DePietro. But if you're ready to go, I think we can just right over.
Great,
Welcome.
thank you. Thanks so much, Senator Watson, and good morning to the committee. Thank you very much. I don't think I've been in this committee. I know a lot of you, but not all of you, but the first time in this particular makeup of the committee. So it's great to be here. Steve Collier, I'm General Counsel at the Agency of Agriculture. Laura DePietro, who's our Water Quality Director, is also here. And most excitingly, one of our actual inspectors is here. She has the best name in water quality. Her name, get this, is Lee King. I'm pretty sure it's the best. I know it's the best in the state. I think it's the best in the country. But she's somebody who's actually out on the ground, working with all the farms and addressing all of these issues every day. All I do is talk about them. So she's the person who gets the work done. So I'd like to try to demystify all this a little bit if I can. First of all, no one ever talks about the good news. The good news is farmers are doing work actually incredibly well. I mean, this body, this legislature created much more stringent regulations for farms back in the Clean Water Act of Vermont in 2016, I believe it was, and they're onerous for farms. They're costly, they're expensive, they're also very protective of water quality and good for water quality. Our farms are doing the work. They're actually about a quarter of the money that the state has invested in farms, in clean water in the state, has gone to farms, and they're responsible for about 80 to 90% or over 90% of the reductions every year. They're of the reduction in phosphorus for the TMDL for Lake Champlain. So it's very efficient, very effective. What makes, I think, us most pleased is farmers have bought in. It's hard to get people to change how they do business. It's not to their advantage to protect water quality. Of course, as a citizen, it is, but to store manure for 6 months, to only be able to spread it certain times of the year, to take up your field by giving up part of it to a vegetative buffer. All these things are very costly to farmers. They're not fighting us on it. They're joining in. They agree. They formed 3 different watershed groups to work on clean water in the state of Vermont. It's a success story. It's a resounding success story that never gets talked about. So that doesn't mean that we don't have work to do. We always do. But we are improving water quality in the state of Vermont. It's because of farmers and other people, but farmers are carrying much more than their share. So we're proud of them for that. And we're proud of the people in our water quality division who are out there every day, who are working to help make that happen. So the whole thing about the CAPO permit Clean Water Act, it's so confusing when you dig into it. It's really quite simple on the surface. The reality is, if you are a point source, and that can be a lot of things, including a farm, but it's basically, think of it as a pipe in anything that's kind of man-made and usually man-made that directs to water. If you are a point source and you're discharging to water, you have to have a permit. That's the fundamental sort of requirement of the Clean Water Act. If you're going to put pollutants in water, it has to be permitted. And the idea of that is so that permitting authority, ANR in the state of Vermont or EPA everywhere, has the ability to limit the pollutants so that our water bodies aren't eutrophying in time. So that whole permitting process is very important. That's what we have. So if you're a point source, can't discharge without a permit. What's kind of mystifying though is you think when you get a permit, you're allowed to discharge, not farms. Farms can never discharge legally. So whether you have a permit or you don't have a permit, you can't discharge. There are very limited exceptions to that. If you have a Clean Water Act permit, then you can discharge in a huge flood event. So if there's a 25-year, 24-hour storm and you flood because of that, that's permissible under the Clean Water Act. Also, I think if you have a structural failure, you can discharge. But the bottom line is, even though it's called a discharge permit, what it requires you do is not discharge. And when you think about it, that's what we all want. That's the whole game, right? And you don't want discharging because discharges are what cause pollution. But the tricky part is the Clean Water Act only covers point source discharge. It doesn't cover anything else. So the federal government says, if you're a point source and you're discharging the water, that's illegal unless you have a permit. For farms, even if you have a permit, it's still illegal. So that's a very incomplete coverage because if you're not a point source and you're not proven to discharge, then there are no regulations under federal law. So the state of Vermont, this body and your neighboring body adopted regulations that effectively extended all the federal regulations under state law to every farm. So whether you are a discharging farm or you're not a discharging farm, you have to take the same exact or almost identical protections. So if you're a point source, you have to have in your discharging, you need a Clean Water Act permit. If you're not doing that, you need a permit from us or the required agricultural practices apply. So basically, Vermont said, federal law, this isn't enough. We're going to cover everybody, and you did. So now every farm in the state of Vermont, regardless of whether you have a Clean Water Act permit or not, can't discharge. So we've actually, it's ironic that we're having this discussion, to me at least, in Vermont about which permit applies, because the reality is every farm is held to really high standards. And we're out on farms much more than other states, as I understand it. We're out on every large farm every single year at least. We're out on every medium-sized farm every 3 years at least. We're out on every certified small farm at least every 7 years. And we're on any farm whenever somebody complains. So there is a comprehensive coverage. And we issue over 100 enforcement actions a year for farms. So farms, they are being regulated. They are being enforced against. The sort of mantra that underlies this whole issue of EPA is this allegation that we don't get along with A&R. We talk to A&R all the time. We work with them all the time. We don't always get along. And I like that. Because I actually believe that I rarely learn when I'm in the room talking to somebody who agrees with me. And so A&R and the Agency of Ag agree on a lot of things, but we also challenge each other. We also push each other, which I think is good. When you have a single focus, when you have a singular focus, and that's all you think about, you're missing at least half the ball. If all you're thinking about is water quality, you're forgetting that we need food too. If all you're thinking about is that we need farmers to grow food, you might not be thinking about water quality. So I don't know, I think any committee, any body benefits from having divergent perspectives. And I think it's very healthy that we have divergent perspectives sometimes. I mean, we agree on far more than we disagree on, but occasionally we disagree. Good. Give it to me, because that's how I get better. So, we do work regularly with A&R. We need to work better with them. There have been some petty disagreements in the past that are frankly unacceptable. I don't think that's happening now. I don't think it's happened in a long time. And even when it does happen, we have those same petty disagreements within our agency, with my friends. I mean, I just don't, it feels like our society has come to the point where we're screaming at each other from the rooftops instead of working together to figure out hard things. A&R and the Agency of Agriculture are not different. We're the executive branch of the state of Vermont. It's incumbent upon us to for taxpayers, for citizens, for farmers, that we work cooperatively together, and we do, and we will continue to do that. Sometimes we're going to disagree. I'm fine with that. I think it makes us better. So, that's the whole push, is these two agencies can't work together. That's not the real objective. The real objective is different. I'm not going to get into what that objective is, but it is very important for farmers that they know what they can do and what they can't do. It's very important that we work closely with the agency and that resources so that everybody knows what's happening, and we're ready and prepared to do that. We're in complete agreement about the steps forward that Pete LaFawn was just talking to you about. So, the administration, A&R, the Agency of Ag, we're all committed to moving forward. As Senator Hardy said, she's introducing a bill that will actually, that if you would choose to adopt it, will actually implement the things that we believe are necessary to give EPA the confidence that it said it needs to make sure that we're doing it appropriately. So, there's been a lot of smoke about this. There are people who have, very legitimate concerns. But this is not, at its core, this is not about water quality. It's about which law applies. And that's important because we have to apply the right law to the right situation. But whether you have a CAFO permit under the Clean Water Act or you have an LFO permit under state law, it's the same requirements. And either way, you can't discharge. And if you do, we're going to enforce against you. We also, there's also this kind of mantra that we let people fix things. That's the most important thing. There's nothing more important than fixing it. That doesn't mean that a penalty may not be appropriate, especially for somebody who's a repeat offender who doesn't want to comply. But the fix is the key. If we're talking about water quality, a $50,000 penalty doesn't do anything about the fixing the problem. It may be a deterrent, but no farmers have money, so it might also put them out of business. So, that balance we think is really important. Since I've been at the Agency of Agriculture for 5 years, we've lost 32% of our dairy farms in 5 years, 32%. And we've lost 11% of our farmland from 2017 to 2022. Since Act 250 was enacted, we've lost 56% of our harvest cropland. We're hemorrhaging farms. No one's talking about that. That's a problem. With climate change and all the problems it poses, we're actually going to become a really important food growing state potentially. Our growing season is likely to be longer. Other areas are probably going to have more drought, not have enough water, have bigger climate emergencies. If we're actually poised to be effective at helping to grow our food and our region's food, we're losing our farmland. So if all we are is forest and development, we're not gonna have that anymore. And our farmers' average age is now 58. We're losing our farmers because it's really hard and they lose money. 57% of our farmers lose money every year. So it's no surprise that they keep going out of business. In the month of November last year, 22 dairy farms dropped out. We used to have about 207 organic dairy farms. I think we have 103 now. So yes, water quality is essential, but so is growing our food. And if we don't balance those interests, we're gonna have, maybe some very pristine water, but we're gonna be importing all of our food from somewhere else. And we're not going to have the beautiful vistas that we have now. We're going to be wooded and developed, and we're going to look a lot more like New Hampshire than Vermont. So these interests are all critically important, but we think balancing them is the best path forward for us. So thank you for listening. I'd be happy to chat. And Laura's here to talk to you a little if you'd like.
Go ahead, Senator Williams.
Farmers are peculiar people. They like dealing with the Department of Ag. Not so sure how they're gonna want to deal with DEC. So is there a possibility you guys could do this initially together? I want to make sure you guys are still, the Ag Department of Ag is still involved in it.
That's a great question, Senator, and I think, part of that's incumbent upon us to demystify, DEC and the Agency of Natural Resources for farmers. It's important that they see us working together. But yeah, we do plan on doing joint inspections with ANR. We've already done that some. The ANR already has and will continue to have the clear authority. If you're a farm that's discharging and ANR says you need a CAFO permit, that's been true for 20 years and it remains true. And nobody's proposing changing that. The harder part is I personally don't have any idea how many permits there should be in Vermont. When you look around the region, New York has 4 times at least as many farms as we do. They have 0 CAFO permits, 0. State of New Hampshire is actually regulated by EPA. It doesn't have a lot of farms. It's got 1 CAFO permit. State of Massachusetts is regulated by EPA. It has 0 CAFO permits. So Vermont doesn't have any CAFO permits either, but that's not atypical or unusual. The question is, under the law, which farms need them, and that's a decision that we understand completely what our needs to make. My point is, I don't know if there should be 3 CAFO permits in the state or 25. I really don't know. But I do know that the whole point is that no farm should be discharging. So if we're doing our job and farms are working with us, there will be 0 CAFO permits. That's what we want, is 0 CAFO permits, because a CAFO permit is only required under the law if you're discharging. So what we want to do is ensure there's no need for CAFO permits. So if we're doing our job effectively, that's where we'll be. But that's, we're gonna have to shake that out and see how that evolves. But another key is that farmers should understand is the standards aren't different. There are some very subtle differences between a CAFO permit and an LFO, which is a large farm permit, but they're small. And under state law, we're actually supposed to have identical standards, and that's what we've been trying to do. So yes, there's a different part of state government that's regulating you, but the standards are supposed to be the same. We have a little bit more authority than they do under federal law for some things, for some farms, but generally the water quality standards are the same. So farmers shouldn't think that everything is going to blow up if they go from one permit to another. you know, the key is, and I think part of the reason the petition exists is the hope is that the enforcement will be much stricter. And you know, you can question the way that we enforce. We believe in education. We want people to comply. We want people to fix it. And we do issue penalties and we issue monetary penalties a lot, but we don't think farmers can afford it. So we're a lot more worried about farmers putting the money into making the fix than we are giving the state of Vermont a penalty. Obviously that depends on the farm. If you keep violating, you refuse, then at some point you might even have to go to court and say you have to stop farming because you're not following the law. We haven't gotten there. That's not where we ever want to be. We find you cited our relationship with farms. We think that's really important because, you know, I've regulated different things my whole career. The best thing you always want is voluntary compliance. When you have people who want to follow the law, you win. When you have people who don't want to follow the law, no matter what you do, because they'll just, you know, you only catch people about, you know, 5% of the time if they're choosing to violate. So we need people to buy in. We think they are. And that doesn't mean perfection, but it does mean success.
I have a question that I think I didn't follow something, which was that so if like no farms should be discharging, get that. But if they are, then they need a CAFO permit. But then the CAFO permit, my understanding was that the CAFO permit doesn't allow them to discharge either. Is that
That's
correct?
That's correct. That's the great irony.
Okay.
You might need the permit, but you still can't discharge.
So it's funny because like the name, like a permit, makes it sound like, okay, well, you are now permitted to do something, but that's not really the case. So could you just like tell us a little bit about what is and maybe I think maybe this is the part either I missed or something, but could you tell us about what is in a CAFO permit?
Sure. So a CAFO permit is similar to our large farm operation permits, and it's basically imposing all of the federal regulations that exist. There's something called the CAFO rule that the EPA adopted and has revised several times because of court decisions. So it's a litany of requirements, and I couldn't try to summarize them all in any sort of detail, but essentially the farm's production area cannot have any water coming off it at all because the production area is considered to be contaminated and full of waste. So farms have to divert water from their protection area and contain it. So a lot of the storage that farms have to do that's so costly is because they, in part, it's their manure, but in part it's they're diverted all of the waste from their production area because they can't let that run off or it's a discharge. So the permit has a lot of requirements about what you have to do in your production area. There's also a lot of requirements about spreading on the field. You know, most of our dairy farms recycle their nutrients by putting them on the field to grow the crops, which is, you know, it's part of the nutrient cycle, which is really conducive. But if you don't spread that manure correctly, it can discharge the water. So there's a series of things like, as an example, you may need to have a vegetated buffer between where you spread and between the waterway so that the nutrients are being absorbed in the soil and being blocked from running off. There's, you know, many more things like that, but the nutrient management plan is sort of the key to field spreading because so you can't stop water. So when it rains, it's going to run off, some of it. But what you can do is if you apply the nutrients to your field in a way that those nutrients are being absorbed instead of pooling on the surface and running off, then you can be appropriately utilizing those. And so the nutrient management plan, they're very complicated, but they're basically a field by field plan where the farm has to calculate the amount of nutrients that's putting in any given field to minimize the chance of runoff. So all of these, I guess the core of your question is everything about a CAFO permit is designed to prevent discharge because you can't discharge with a CAFO permit. So the whole point is to make farms do all of these litany of things that prevent a discharge. So but the irony is whether they have the permit or not, a farm can't discharge and it violates the law if they don't have a permit, and it violates the law if they do have a permit. So what they have to do is, you know, follow the law, and sometimes that's easier said than done. Does that answer your question, Senator?
It does. That's That's helpful. It sort of sounds like it's best if, and I think you were getting, I mean, you said this, but it's really best if a farm doesn't have a discharge to begin with. And so like, and if they do, then it's, you can think of the permit as kind of a cleanup plan. It's kind of like here's a set of things that you now have to do to ensure that you don't have discharge.
I think that's true, and another way to look at that, I think, is that the federal government only asserts jurisdiction once there's a discharge. And the federal government also equals A&R in this case, because the EPA has delegated its authority. So the Clean Water Act, the way that it's been interpreted to apply to farms, is only triggered by discharge. But with farms, the EPA road rules say you can't discharge, except in those unusual circumstances that I talked about. So you're right, it is a cleanup plan. It's not a discharge allowance, which is different from how most NIPD's permits are designed. So that's why, it's so ironic is that, to me at least, farms can't discharge. And so in this, the legislature said, we're going to extend that. We're not satisfied with the EPA, with the Clean Water Act. We're going to say all farms have to follow this requirements. And so we have this incredibly comprehensive coverage. It just depends which law applies. And it's, it's easy to say what discharge requires a permit. It's not always easy to determine what exactly constitutes a discharge. And another interesting piece is the EPA in the past has said that if you are a farm and you discharge, you need a permit, but you don't need a permit if you promptly correct the discharge. Now that's advice that we've had from the EPA in the past. That's not what Region 1 has said recently. I don't know what federal EPA thinks about this, but you clearly can't discharge without a permit. No question about that. If you do discharge, A&R, EPA has every right to require a permit, but there is discretion, at least according to the EPA in the past, that if you fix whatever is causing the discharge, you don't necessarily need a permit. That's a question for A&R. That's not our bailiwick. They decide what requires a permit and what doesn't. But there is at least precedent in the past that if you fix it, you still don't need a permit because you fix it. Now, that would still be a violation to have the discharge to begin with that A&R could enforce on or EPA could enforce on, and we can enforce on for things they did that led to the discharge.
Okay, and I have one other question, and I'm channeling Senator McDonald on this one, and so I feel like I need to ask this question, but I don't mean to cause any trouble by it. But can you tell us how tile drains either applies or does not apply to this situation?
Do you really feel like you have to?
Well, I can also save that question for another time.
No, I'm
I
kidding. I'm kidding. It's, it depends on who you ask.
Okay.
There are plenty of water quality advocates who want to equate tile drain to a point source. I haven't checked on this in a while, but I've looked before. Last time I looked, no court had ever found that. Tile drain has been an accepted farming practice forever. It's very effective. It's very efficient. That doesn't mean it can't cause problems, or just like anything can. But my basic understanding of it, which is I'm not a soil scientist, but it's actually helps water infiltrate into the soil instead of run off the surface. And so, there are people with different opinions about it, but I think legally, it's pretty clear to say that it's not a point source. It's an accepted farming practice. So you're still subject to all of the requirements about not being able to discharge waste. And if you're not following your NMP, your nutrient management plan, so maybe you're oversaturating your soil so that it's so ridden with phosphorus that an excessive amount of phosphorus is coming up through your tile drain, that might be an actionable. That might be something that you could act on because you're not following your NMP. And so whether that extra phosphorus is coming off the surface or whether it's coming out through your tile drain, that might be something that's completely, subject to enforcement. But from my perspective, at least, if you were following your NMP and you were following everything about what you have to do to manage your manure or your fertilizer or your waste, Doesn't matter whether you have tile drain or whether you don't.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Appreciate that. Okay, great. Any other questions that folks have at the moment? Okay, thanks. I just had to ask that to like get it out of the way.
I think that's fine.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions or thoughts or comments? Okay, great. All right, well, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to working more on this after the break. With that, team, I believe we are done for the morning. Sorry, you look like you're.
I
Yes.
think Laura DePietro is here to present for the Agency of Ag, and
Oh my gosh.
she's the real expert on this stuff.
Okay. Sorry. I had missed that. I apologize. Thank you. So we'll switch. You're
Thank
great.
you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Welcome. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. And so I'm Laura Petro with the Agency of Ag. I'm the Director of Water Quality. And I have to say, Mr. Collier, we had a little chat and he was like, I'll do this for the presentation. And then you just stole my whole presentation.
Oh, wow.
So I can just highlight things that I think we didn't necessarily speak about. And sorry, I should have connected into the Zoom. So as I connect, I want to just say some about the coordination, because none of this is in my presentation, but you know, Bethany and Pete behind me, we meet quarterly. And so we discuss issues, Collier and Julie Moore, the secretary, Anson Tebbets, all of the higher leadership, it includes these folks and myself, also meet roughly quarterly. Then every Friday, staff that work for Pete and Bethany and staff that work for me also meet to talk about details, right? Specific cases and things that are going on. And then additionally, staff like Lee are coordinating when A&R wants to go out and visit a farm that we might be going to. And so it's pretty regular, you know, when you get all of those meetings. And in fact, yesterday, I spent the entire day at National Life, right? Sitting in meetings with DEC folks. So we are two government agencies, but we are all government and we work together. And when you look at how we operate in terms of enforcement, one of the things you'll notice, for instance, you know, EPA definitely has a space where it is A&R's role to be the lead decider. But because we are government, any report that we do, and you'll see on A&R's website, they can use it at A&R to do the enforcement work. So eyes and ears on the ground that see something can be used because we document it with photos, we write up a whole thing, we do a whole report, and that report can be the basis of an enforcement action with another agency, because we're one state government. So we collaborate in a lot of spaces. I do not want to join my computer on you.
And your slides are on our website, so people can see them if you're on it.
I think I need to.
There you go. Sorry.
So we are live. Okay. So we just wanted to share this. This is, you know, we have a staff get together just to remember too that there are a lot of people that are behind this work. And one of the things that I've experienced with the staff that we have, well, there's this whole mantra, right? The fox is watching the hen house. I can tell you that every person that we hire is not there thinking they're a fox watching the hen house. They're coming because typically they love the outdoors, right? It's an outdoor job most of the time. But they're invested in water quality and they want to see progress. If you do your job every day and you don't see progress, you get very little back from your job. And so they go to these farms, they find these problems and they're working towards fixing them. They're very committed folks. And I just don't want to have that impression that these folks are for any reason trying to protect or hide or do anything. And one of the things we've done moons ago, because of this, you know, this mantra, the fox watching the house, is we send two people out together and we rotate those people, right? So it's not like you can get a buddy and try and squirrel away.
they're rotated throughout, and at any point, EPA or DEC, anyone can rotate within that as well, which we've done. So we try to be as transparent as possible, and again, I do think we have incredibly dedicated staff. And I'm just gonna touch on what Steve did not mention with a lot of our work that we do to help the farmers. And, that is because essentially there's the federal government that can provide help. You had mentioned NRCS, but the state has those resources as well. And so that's a big part of what we do. We have a bunch of engineers that help farmers, because if you are to go to the private sector, which we do use at times, typically for much more riskier structural work, we will use private sector engineers. But to hire an engineer to do a job and then to implement the job just makes the cost of it go up. Having in-house engineers available to farms allows the ability to do a lot more projects at a lower cost. And so that's why we have these resources. But so one of the things we do, there's a clean water budget, and there's a lot of funding that comes to the Agency of Agriculture. And we move that money predominantly to farmers, but also to the partnership. There's over 100 people across NRCS or conservation districts, UVM extension, folks who are going out and doing farm work. So you can see in there 1,240 or 74 visits to work with producers in a single year. And so those are all the acronyms are different funding sources and programs, but it's people going on farms to help farms figure out how to plan for change and how to get resources to get that change. And then there's also on the bottom graph, educational events. So farmers, Act 64 of 2015 required farmers to get education. So kind of like, you think about professional liability, right? People have to get continuing education credit. Farmers have to do that too. And so there's a path to create these programs. So farmers are pretty educated about all of this stuff because of that. I'm not going to go through each program, but we have several programs. We can help farms from grazing to putting in cover crops, which helps keep a vegetated cover growing all winter long, to equipment that helps them do corn planting differently, for instance, because everyone can, if you own a corn planter, you can do it the old fashioned way, but if you want to do it a better way, that's a new investment and it's a different investment. And, one of the things about water quality, well, yes, there are these benefits that come, there are long-term benefits to a farmer, right? Improved soil health, all of that, it doesn't come in their milkshake typically, right? And it's gonna take a while for that to really build up to be something. And so to make investments in water quality doesn't have a good return on investment in terms of immediate cash. And so the state has these programs to help farmers make these changes more rapidly. So here's just another subset of programs and opportunities. Again, this graph shows you, last year about $18.4 million. And this is just money that's coming through the Agency of Agriculture. One of the things I hope you can see is the trajectory of that funding has gone up significantly since Act 64 of 2015. And that really, I'll show you the next graph, but just keep this trajectory in mind. And you can see, in the COVID years, it went down, right? Because we just didn't go out and do the work because we couldn't. We were all told to stay home. But that trajectory literally mirrors progress, right? And so farmers, again, having resources, they take them and they do the work. It's not a challenge of having all these resources and having to return money every year. That is not our challenge. And one thing you'll notice about this graph is this last year, it looks like it's down, but that's not actual down. So the next time I come to you and show you this graph next year, you'll see that 2024 likely went up. And that's just because July is the cutoff for the fiscal year and a bunch of farming and practices happen in the fall, right? So that people, like for instance, that seeding down so that all winter there's grass or vegetation growing. Those practices, for instance, are not even accounted in that yet. So they'll come through in the next iteration. But what I think is really important to show here is that of all the sectors that have something to do, right? Everybody, it was an all-in approach, right? Everybody's got to do something for water quality. Farming is knocking it out of the park, right? They have been more than 80, 90% in some years, more than that of the reductions of phosphorus. And so I just think that's really an important space because when you think about how much we've accomplished. This has only been, roughly almost not even 9 years since the new TMDL. Granted, it's a 20-year plan. And we had gotten a letter as a, state to say, well, your progress looks like it needs to ramp up if you're gonna stay on target. I do just wanna remind you, in those first 5 years, there was a massive amount of rule changes that we had to do, like all the things that we said, okay, we're gonna create a funding source, the Clean Water Fund, we're gonna roll that out. DC had a lot to set up as well. And so when you spend the first couple of years trying to get everything going, you can see that the progress is really starting to pick up in the years after. And I think you're gonna continue to see that because farmers are engaged. This equipment we are right now writing contracts for, people are gonna implement that on, 1,000 acres, for example, that isn't happening right now. And so each year, you're just gonna see continued progress. And the coolest part about it is it's affordable to do agricultural water quality. So if you look at this bottom graph where it says water quality division, 24% of the clean water budget goes to agriculture. But the reductions you get for those dollars are 77% of the reductions. So it's bang for the buck is absolutely there. I will say one of the challenges is a lot of the practices that farms do, they have to do every year. They're annual practices because farming, the land is the biggest component of the TMDL. Barnyards and all this conversation we're having about practices in the barnyards is a very small percentage of the issue in the larger scheme. The landscape is the space that really where the majority of the reductions need to come. So in order to get reductions from that space, you are going to rely on the decisions that are made every year by a farmer. And so just overall too, like the progress that's being made on the TMDL against 20 years is about a little over a quarter of the way there for the progress that needs to be made. So definitely, there's some progress that still needs to happen, but I do think an amazing framework has been set in all the programs that DEC operates and ag and transportation to now just keep the progress going. So okay, just want to show you some pictures about what this money does, because everybody loves great pictures. So you can see the difference of the left and the right. This whole barnyard area with manure would just be able to run downstream and be heavily impacted, or run down the hill, presumably to some potential ditch or stream that could be down there. By containing it and putting it in a space, the farmer can take their equipment and scrape up the manure, so take it out, which is very difficult in the left picture, and then get it to a storage. And then take it from that storage and use a nutrient management plan and apply it on the field so that it's used as a fertilizer and gets a benefit back to the farm and to the crop. So that's the kind of, these are our bigger projects, our BNP program, which is we get capital funding for this, and they're typically engineered projects. And then here's another example, right? We luckily we have, our staff stick around. They really like the work that they do. And this is an example of a farm that had animals accessing the surface water, put up a fence, planted some trees, and you can see how beautiful that site looks at this point. So these programs are partnership programs. We work with federal government on this one, for example. And the farmer is able to, they have to give up land, but they do get a small payment, $21 an acre. I don't think it's anything massive in terms of the reason they do it, right? But I think they do it for conservation purposes, but it does have some benefit. This is actually grazing, which I know it kind of doesn't look like it, but there's a fence on the picture on the left, and we have grazing programs to help people seed things down and get better grazing. And for instance, we pay people if they never let their grass go below 3 inches. Because the higher you keep it, the better your grass will grow for water, for feed. And so just trying to say, don't hammer a pasture area and creating incentives for that. And one thing that's really important about all of the work that we do is we verify everything we tell you, right? So we have this quality assurance plan to say, if we're going to tell you that this reduction in phosphorus has occurred, somebody has gone and looked at that to say, yep, they signed up for that program, they did that practice, and that is being implemented. For the majority of everything that we do, which is very different than a lot of other programs. And it's just because we're out there a lot and we're trying to make sure that the accountability is real and people see it. And here's another one, crop field, and the farm seeded it down. And, you know, they can, in this situation, this is kind of a different, when we talk about, for instance, if we're gonna talk about buffers in our program or in CAPO, typically you cannot harvest those, right? And use them for like hay. But we have a separate program, the seeding and filter strip program, that says if you would like to do that, you can, right? Because if you take a cornfield and you take a hay field and you mix them together, it's not the most ideal. Moving trucks and doing all the work, it doesn't necessarily make sense from a farming perspective. But if the farm can make that buffer wide enough, they may be able to change their methods and make that work. And so in this case, we have this program that does that. So you can basically have the cornfield shrink on the inside and have the whole outside of the field be essentially the hay field. So changing how the whole landscape might look. All right, so we regulate farms, and here's a great picture of Lee doing her work regulating on farms. And I just want to show you, so these are the rules that we have in place. So the rules that apply to all farms are the required agricultural practice rules. And those have been in place since 1986. And, you know, the reason those were generated way back then is that there were exemptions in law for what farming practices were, but they weren't defined. And so the legislature asked the Agency of Agriculture to define what those practices are that would be acceptable practices to say, if you're doing this, this is, you know, within the bounds of the law. And so that was when that was first created, but it was called the accepted ag practices back then. And so there was all this nuance about, everyone thought if they weren't bulls, from the farmers didn't think that, but everyone else who heard that term thought, well, these are just voluntary. So at one point they were changed to be called the required ag practices rules. But then the medium and the large farm rules are the two rules that were created in the Agency of Agriculture to essentially mirror in many ways what the CAPO requirements are. So CAPO has been around for a long time, but states were encouraged to create state level programs to basically, these are no discharge permits. And you can see we've done large farm permitting since 1999. And we've done medium farm permitting since 2006. So these have been around for quite a long time that these farms have been complying with these rules. And then recently last year, we created a rule that people who are professionals who write nutrient management plans for farmers, they have to be certified. So if a farm is going to pay somebody to write them a nutrient management plan, which they're very complicated, most people need some help, just because of the sheer volume of work that needs to be done. They want to make sure they should get that product and it should comply with the law, right? And so making sure that those people are holding that and providing a service to the farm that does meet the requirements of the law. And then this last rule, the best management practice rule, is essentially a space, it's mostly about our grant programs, but if a farm is following the REPs, the required ag practices, and it's not enough, right? We look at it instead of 3-minute warning, okay. And it's not enough. We can, as an agency of ag, request that a farm do more. And so that's an important piece. So not only do we have rules that apply to everybody, we also have rules that are can be increased. This conversation was just had, and I just want to use this image to explain it, and then I'll just wrap up. So CAPO's actual discharges, and if you can see on the left, this is actually a farm that's under enforcement with A&R. The stream is right next to that farm. And the waste is going, our red lines are what we call risk lines. This is all from our database and our inspection work. But the waste, you can see, is leaving that production area and going into that stream. The one on the right, you can see there's red lines, but if you see way down, the waters are, you know, north and south of that image. You can see there's blue lines that represent rivers or streams. It's not getting to water. But I do think we all have an appreciation that all water runs downhill eventually, and you may not see it at the time, but long term, if you just keep loading nutrients, the nutrients are gonna find their way. Maybe not the waste specifically because it might degrade and break down, but the nutrients in the system may get there. And so this is an example on the right of something that it's not a discharge, but our rules at the Agency of Agriculture can step in and say, we are going to prevent this from becoming a discharge. And so that's a space where, again, Steve described the proactiveness. I lied, one more slide. There's two legal cases with CAPO that I think are really important. And both of them kind of knock down two things. The red words that I highlighted is a potential discharge and then proposed discharge. And those were shut down. They basically said, you cannot, you have to have an actual discharge in order to have a CAPO. So I will stop there and thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge you've got some more slides that I look like they have some great information in, and I'm so glad we didn't skip you because this is great. And if we need to schedule some more time for you to come back and finish these slides, that'd be fine. So thank you so much, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah, and I just encourage you all, the very last slide has a link, a hyperlink to our data. So that you can see that that's a public dashboard to see the things that we're doing. So point and click in there and have fun.
Okay, thank you.